And now we can proceed to the next topic of our discussion, the final topic of our discussion for today, the research ethics. Why do we discuss research ethics at the very beginning? Well, because if you didn't think about research ethics before you planned your study and before you conducted your study, you may be very disappointed to discover that you cannot publish this study because the common ethical procedures have not been followed in this study. And these common ethical procedures exist in psychology for several decades with the goal of protecting our participants from us. There are some classical examples of studies conducted in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s that were completely dubious from an ethical point of view. Think of John Watson and the little Albert, who was maybe traumatized by this fairly cruel experiment. Or think about Carney Landis, an emotional researcher, I think he was in Harvard, who asked people to perform all kinds of unpleasant tasks, like cutting off the head of a rat, and he would film people's facial expressions to understand something about emotions. Obviously, this gives some very valid information, but no, it's not a good idea to make animals suffer in such a cruel way and make people suffer who inflict this harm on animals. So why is, you probably have already an idea of why is research ethics important. And there are different types of ethical standards in psychology. Some standards for researchers, which describe how we should deal with our participants in such a way as to ensure we don't harm them. And we'll talk about those right now. But there are also some ethical standards for scientists and publication authors and for test developers and test users. And we'll focus on those in the next section of our discussion today. And finally, there are some ethical standards for psychotherapists, for counselors, which say clearly that we should not engage in non-work relationships with our clients, because this will be harmful in the end for our therapeutic relationship, and it may be very harmful for the client. We will not go into this, but if you studied counseling, you're probably aware of all those things. So what are the goals of research ethics? First, we want to protect the physical and mental health of individuals and animals participating in our research. Second, we want to protect privacy and we want to ensure the confidentiality of information that people give us. Otherwise, people will not trust us and we will not be able to get any scientific information whatsoever. And third, we need to ensure that our scientific data are correct, that no one has manipulated the data. And this is called academic integrity, a third aim of research ethics. We'll start with the care about participants' health and privacy. These principles come mainly from medical research, and they were developed after the Second World War, when the Nazis performed some very interesting but very cruel experiments in concentration camps where people suffered a lot and people had no choice to stop participating in those experiments. And there are also other notorious examples when doctors in the States inoculated some ethnic minorities with infectious diseases, and they looked how those diseases develop, and people who were inoculated did not even know that they were infected by the doctors intentionally as a part of experiment. So this is completely unethical. This is why, based on those examples, that we are so careful about ethics right now. And there are several documents where those ethical principles are written down, like the Declaration of Helsinki. In the States, they refer often to the Belmont Protocol, and there are also various research ethics codes that exist in different countries, but they describe pretty much the same principles. The first principle is respect for person. We need to treat people as autonomous agents, and we need to provide them meaningful choice. We should not force them to participate in our experiments. It should always be a free, conscious decision of a person to participate in our experiment, and the person needs to be aware of all the information that they need to know in order to make this decision, what this research is going to be about, what it's going to require. And when people don't have complete autonomy, like children or maybe mental patients, with children you need to ask for a parental consent. But nowadays there is also the requirement to ask for the child's assent to participate in the study. So you need both the consent of the parent and the child. And if the child says no, even if the parent gave consent, you are not allowed to do research with them. And with mental health patients, for example, you need to ask caregivers or doctors to give consent on their behalf. But those people who give consent should be aware of all the information about your study, because this decision needs to be informed. The second principle is beneficence. Basically, do not harm. Obviously, sometimes there is no choice but to harm people. If you are testing a new drug, you don't know about potential side effects. So the principle translates to the principle maximize benefits, minimize risks. If your study involves some risks, you need to introduce ways and methods to manage those risks, to ensure that these risks will be minimal. If you are doing some kind of interview about a very traumatic experience, you need to tell people what the interview is going to be about. And you need to try and exclude from your study people for whom this might be extremely traumatic or who might have long-term consequences, like people with mental health conditions, or maybe, I don't know, people with pregnancy. So we need to be very careful about that. And in medical research, there are a lot of different approaches that they use. For example, if they're testing a drug against cancer, if the drug does not work, a person can die from cancer. So they try to create the study in such a way that only people with less harmful forms of cancer receive this drug until it's proven to work. And the composition of groups is also managed in such a way that in an experimental group, there is a smaller number with more severe symptoms. So then statistically, it's all controlled for. But the goal is to maximize benefits, minimize risks. And justice, this principle mainly applies to medical research. If you're testing a new drug that can save lives, you need to include both people who are rich and people who are poor, for example. It would be unethical to only offer it to rich patients. And all these principles are very abstract. It's impossible to say this study is ethical, this study is unethical, based on those abstract principles. Think of them as values. Values need some kind of thinking, some kind of expert evaluation of their application in a particular situation in order to make a decision. Is this ethical or not? This is why in different countries there are institutional review boards in the States or research ethics committees in Europe. In some countries, it's not really mandatory to go through a research ethics committee with every research project. For example, in Russia or in France, this is considered kind of optional. But in Holland, in the Netherlands, or in the States or in Great Britain, every research project, even a student project, as long as it involves some kind of interaction with people, some kind of information about people, it must absolutely go through a research ethics committee before the researcher can conduct the data collection. And sometimes it takes between 2 weeks and sometimes 2 months, especially if the study is kind of complicated. That's why in the States there is this whole discussion that institutional review boards, maybe they kind of hinder science instead of helping it. And in the States, they are very strict, and they are composed by not only psychologists, because psychologists would obviously approve each other's research more easily, but they are composed also of people from other disciplines and of people from community without specialized education. So those institutional review boards are a pain. In Europe, typically research ethics committees are comprised by people from the discipline, like all of us are psychologists. And here in the Higher School of Economics, we have also our own research ethics committee, which can review a research project if you would like to get some advice about research ethics to ensure that your research conforms with ethical principles, or if you want to publish in a journal that requires a research ethics committee approval. There are actually most journals require it. They might not ask for this particular paper, but at least they want to ensure that your research is in line with the principles described in the Declaration of Helsinki. So it would be good to get some research ethics committee approval document, because if a journal asks for it and you don't have it, oops, your paper is rejected straight away without review. But even if your paper is not required to go through a research ethics committee, even in your master's thesis, for example, where you're not required to get any ethical approval, at least at present, we need to make sure that we use the practical measures to ensure that our study implements the ethical principles. And these are three things: informed consent, data protection, and debriefing. We need informed consent to ensure that people have made a choice to participate in our study. We need data protection measure to ensure that the information that they gave us remains confidential. And we need debriefing to ensure that if we deceived people or if we maybe traumatized them a little bit, that there will be no harmful consequences. The first thing is informed consent. What is an informed consent form? Basically, it's the information about your study that people read before they decide to take part in that study. If your study involves an in-person experiment, when someone comes to your lab, you typically give them a paper that they need to read and sign. And this way you can file it. And then if they say, oh, we did not want this, you can say, you have signed up to participate in this experiment, you consented. Online, this procedure is typically less strict. When we do an online research, we typically give people a paragraph with information about our study and then press this button if you agree to participate in this study, or press this button if you would like to decline. But whether it is on paper or in an electronic format, the informed consent form must include the following elements. First, the description of your research. What is the goal of your research? What your research will require. For example, we are studying associations between different personality traits. You will be asked, within this research, you will be asked to complete a 500-item questionnaire, which takes about an hour and a half. 3 people randomly selected out of all study participants will receive book vouchers. So if your study involves some kind of compensation, you also need to mention it here so that people would be very clear on what terms that they are participating. If your study involves any risks or maybe benefits, you need to mention them. If you're going to discuss, for example, some traumatic experiences, or some questions might actually tap into sensitive topics like maybe sexual orientation or drug abuse, you need to inform people that there will be some sensitive questions. And if your study involves some risks, for example, it's an interview about traumatized topics, you need to say how risks will be managed. For example, everyone who experiences traumatic stress will be referred to a counselor. And the most important part of informed consent, an explicit notification that a person is free to withdraw from the study at any time, before the study begins, after the beginning of the study, or after the end of the study, without any negative consequences. So after the end of your data collection, you might, I've never had it happen, but sometimes you might find a person who, a week after they complete your questionnaire, they come and say, oh, could you please delete my answers because I'm so upset by what I told you. And your duty as a researcher is to be able to track down this particular questionnaire and delete it. And finally, in the informed consent form, there are contacts of researchers and of the ethics committee that has approved this research. Obviously, a question that all of us might ask at this point: if we describe our research to people who are going to take part in it, is this not going to undermine our conclusions? Because if we told people what we are studying, this might actually influence how they reply, how they respond to our research procedures. Imagine if Stanley Milgram told people that he was studying obedience to authority. Obviously, people would not obey. This is why we often have to use deception Deception is giving people imprecise, kind of very general information about your study aims, or maybe even misleading information when you say you're studying memory, but you're studying obedience to authority. Deception is okay, only in case when it would be impossible to perform the study without it. And also, whenever you use deception, you must debrief your participants. And now it has been known that some of the early participants from Stanley Milgram's study of obedience were not debriefed. Canadian researchers have found some protocols of interviews with those participants, and it appears that some of them went home thinking that they killed the person behind the wall, and they kept looking at the papers every day to see an announcement of someone being killed in a Yale laboratory, and they suffered this traumatic stress for days and days. Obviously, this is something that we need to avoid, and if this was known during Stanley Milgram's lifetime, maybe it would have had really bad consequences for his career. But obviously, the standards that require debriefing did not exist back in 1961 when he conducted this study. So debriefing can take the form of a post-experimental interview when you encounter people and you discuss, you tell them the truth about your experiment, or in an online study, it can be just a paragraph with information after the end of the questionnaire when people are given the true information about the study. And typically at this point, we also ask them not to share this information with others because this could undermine the integrity of our study. The only situation when you should not use debriefing is when debriefing could result in additional harm. For example, you selected participants based on some unpleasant property. You took a group of students, you asked them to rate each other on personality traits, and persons who were rated as the most unpleasant, you invited them for the interview or whatever, some manipulation. Don't tell it to them, please. Of course, not all studies require informed consent. But if you think your study does not require informed consent, this is not a decision for you. It's a decision for the Research Ethics Committee. Typically, the study does not require informed consent if we gather information about people from some publicly available sources where people have placed them at their own consent. For example, if you mine social networks and you extract some information from social network profiles, there is no need to ask every person whose profile you are mining. Or when the study does not do anything to people that would be different from what they would encounter on a daily basis in their normal life. For example, Stanley Milgram, he would travel around the States, and in order to measure altruism in different cities, he would throw some envelopes around, and he would then track what percentage of these envelopes will be picked up by passers-by and mailed through the mailbox. And he evaluated this way how helpful are people in different cities. Obviously, this is an intervention that is completely harmless, and it does not involve anything that is not part of everyday life. Or at school, if you're interested in the properties of different ability tests, and people anyway, children anyway complete these ability tests as part of their normal regular school routines, it doesn't really matter whether you give them an old test or a new test, as long as you don't ask them to report on anything that they would not normally be asked to report as part of their school life. But of course, if you're asking them some strange questions, you need to have their consent and the consent of parents. So informed consent is very important. In every study, you need to have some form of informed consent. If you did not use informed consent, your study is probably going to be impossible to publish if this is discovered at the stage when your study is reviewed. And this might be discovered because reviewers might often ask questions about informed consent, confidentiality, and so on. The second principle is protecting people's confidentiality. You can see here on this Dilbert cartoon when the boss says, according to the anonymous online employee survey, you don't trust management. What's up with that? How did you dare not to trust me? This is exactly something we want to avoid. If a study is anonymous, we need to make sure this information is not associated with people. How do we do it? First of all, the important criterion: we infringe privacy in case if two criteria are fulfilled. First, we collect information about individuals which, if it were disclosed, could harm their reputation, their social status, employability, endanger them, and so on. If you are asking people what their favorite color is, probably this is completely harmless. If you're asking them about their favorite brand of chocolate, this is probably also harmless, unless the person works in a chocolate company. Then they might get fired. So we should not assume that all information we collect is completely harmless. But we need to bother only when we collect this information with some identifiers, with some data that allow to identify specific people who gave those answers. If you don't collect any identifiers, there is no problem. But if you collect some data that allows directly or indirectly to identify a person, you need to protect your information from disclosure. How can we do it? Well, first of all, the best recipe. If you can avoid collecting identifiers, try to avoid it. Emails are also identifiers because they are linked to a person. IP addresses are also typically considered as identifiers because in theory it's possible to find out who uses a particular computer, who was behind the screen at a certain point in time, even if it's dynamic IP. Security services can track it down, so it's best to assume that IP are also identifiers. Of course, sometimes we need to collect identifiers. There is no way to do our research without doing it. For example, your research involves several stages, and you need to find a way to identify people who participated at pre-test and at post-test. You might ask them to use some nicknames, but nicknames, they might forget them, so you might ask them to give you emails. And this is also okay. But if you do collect some identifiers, just make sure you anonymize your data afterwards. Imagine that hackers or police break into your computer and they steal data files. So if they steal these data files, they should be unable to make any sense out of the data. They should be unable to use this data to harass individuals. This is why the best recipe is to keep identifiers separately from data and keep them safely in a password protected or in a password protected folder or in a restricted access kind of safe locked with a key. And maybe it's a good idea to delete identifiers from your data set after you have collected your data. You don't need them anymore. And if you share data with other researchers or if you publish your data in open repositories, only share completely anonymized data. This is especially important with respect to qualitative data, where people might give you some details in an interview that might make it possible in principle to identify them. Like I grew up in such a city, I studied in such and such university, and this is the job that I do now. Based on this combination, someone might potentially discover who that person is. So that's why if you include your interview in your master's dissertation or in a paper or you publish it in some open repository, you need to remove all those details, like replace the city name with an X, the company names, and people's names with nicknames, and so on. And of course, you need to inform your participants about confidentiality. In your informed consent, you need to say this study is completely anonymous, or if the study is not anonymous, why do you need identifiers? And what measures are you going to use to protect this information from disclosure? If you're doing your research in the Netherlands, for example, they have very strict requirements and very detailed descriptions of how information is going to be stored, who's going to use it, when identifiers will be deleted, and so on. Because this is what people need to know when they decide to participate in your study. So these are just some general considerations pertinent to protecting our research participants and whether our study is required or not to go through an ethics committee. It's a good idea to always make sure you have informed consent, you have debriefing if you need it, and you make sure you protect the data from disclosure. The second group of research ethics standards are related to protecting this science.